Welcome back to Nzone Focus. UK psychiatrist Dr Anthony Daniels worked with violent offenders in the British prison system and sees the fallout from their criminal behaviour on their families, many of whom end up being admitted to hospital, not only suffering from mental and physical abuse, but also dependent on drugs and alcohol. He describes his observations of an underclass in his book Life at the Bottom, in which he links the liberal ideology with proven repercussions such as endemic violence, criminality and sexual promiscuity. Dr Daniels has spent the last couple of weeks in this country talking about how we can learn from the British experience, and he joins me now. Welcome to you. Now, your pen name is Theodore Dalrymple, and yes, we will call you by that, but where did the name come from?
I and the editor of The Spectator made it up because I needed a pen name at that time, and I wanted to sound slightly old and bad-tempered, and I think it does sound a bit old and bad-tempered, but it also had to be a name that didn't appear on the medical register.
So there's no Dr Dalrymples in the UK?
No Dr Theodore Dalrymple. There are Dr Dalrymple, but not Dr Theodore Dalrymple.
The perception when you came across to New Zealand to tour was that you were coming to basically say, look, we need to lock prisoners away and we need to throw away the key. Is that the basis of your message?
No, it's not. I do think that we need longer sentences for recidivists, people who've demonstrated that they're going to repeat their offences and that they live by crime. However, that's not my main message. I've been trying to say that there are two aspects to the prevention of crime, what one might call the primary prevention of crime, which is trying to prevent people from becoming criminals in the first place, and then secondary prevention, how you prevent people who have committed lots of crimes or appear as if they're going to commit lots of crimes from repeating their offences. Okay, and these two things are different.
Okay, well, could we deal with those two things? Let's start with firstly preventing crime.
Yes.
I mean, you've spent a lot of time with prisoners, you've talked to them, you've understood where they're coming from, you've spoken to their victims. How do we prevent crime? How do we bring a person to a point where they don't want to commit the crime in the first place?
Well, I think it goes back actually quite early in their lives and the way that they're brought up. And one thing that is not quite universal, but at least exceedingly common amongst criminals, is the family breakdown which they have experienced as children. So that, for example, they very rarely live with their fathers. Many don't know their fathers or they hate their fathers, but they've also lived with stepfathers, one or more of whom may have been violent. They don't so much have brothers as half-brothers and sisters, and so on and so forth. And to give a very small example, many of the prisoners to whom I spoke had never in their entire lives eaten at a table with another person. So that they're, in a sense, they're living in an asocial world. It's a predatory world where you do what you can get away with. And that starts very early in life, actually. You can see it in the way that they're disciplined or not disciplined. And everything about the world around them is that of egotism, solipsism, and so forth.
I asked the head youth court judge in New Zealand this question and about the effect of fatherlessness, and also saw some research from Heritage Foundation in the US that said a 10% increase in solo-parented families, 17% increase in juvenile crime.
Yes.
Do you see that link as well? Do you back up that link?
I think I think not only is there a statistical link, but perhaps more importantly, you can see that there's a meaningful link.
Well, what is the meaning of it? Why is it that a child who comes from a broken home sees crime as the answer?
Well, I think what happens is that he doesn't see any boundaries, or no boundaries have any meaning for him.
But of course you can get the other extreme where the stepfather steps in and literally the boundaries are there, but it goes totally over the top. It's abuse, it's domestic violence.
Well, that's right, but it tends to be arbitrary, actually. Even in his violence, there is no rule. It's just what he feels like at the time. So there's no actual rule that you're breaking when he becomes violent. And the problem is that what the child learns is that you decide what you should do, not according to some rule, ethical rule, but according to first what you can get away with and the mood of the people around you, and that's not very good. So there are no boundaries with any meaning. And the first boundaries that they often come across, I'm afraid, are hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue, and at least it maintains the distinction. You have, in order to be a hypocrite, at least you have to know the distinction between vice and virtue. And we're trying to create a society in which there is neither vice nor virtue.
Right. So we've lost that moral ground. I mean, you make an interesting statement in the book Life at the Bottom, where you say antisocial behaviour increases in proportion to the excuses that intellectuals make for it.
I think that's right, yes. And the excuses that intellectuals make are of a kind of... they treat the subjects of their excuses as if they were inanimate objects, rather than people who are making decisions about how they behave.
So, for example, when a person commits a crime, what we tend to do is we try to figure out what were the contributing factors to that person choosing that lifestyle of crime. Is that the right thing to do?
Well, I think it is a right thing to do, provided you remember that the factors affect the person's mind. What is important is that it is the person's mind that is being affected. He's not just a billiard ball going off in a direction. It's all passing through his mind. So there are several things. If you take the question of violence, for example, domestic violence, you will see that actually it has a kind of rationality. It's not pleasant, but there is a rationality to it. Men who are violent to their women are attempting to control their women to make sure that they stay within their possession. And it actually works for a time, and eventually the women leave and so on.
Why do women stay that long, though?
Well, I think there are several reasons. The first is they're not persuaded that anything can be any different, because they usually live in surroundings, the majority live in surroundings where this kind of violence is so common that they don't believe that any other kind of relationship is possible. That's the first thing. Secondly, they themselves make excuses for the men. They accept the idea that the men can't help it, if you like. I mean, often women have come to me and say, I think he needs help. And then they talk about his violence as if it were a kind of epilepsy.
So this is back to your original statement that as we make excuses, we actually encourage antisocial behaviour.
Well, yes, and we encourage people to absorb the excuses themselves. So you will get violent men coming and saying, something happens to me, I can't help myself. As the expression in England is, I go into one. And the one that they're supposed to go into is something like an epileptic fit.
Yes.
Well, it's not true. I mean, I used to say to the women, well, would he do it in front of me? And they suddenly think, well, no, of course he wouldn't, which suggests that actually it is under some kind of control.
Okay.
So there's that. There is a third thing, and I put this rather tentatively, women are persuaded that if men are violent, at least they care for them. And there is a Russian expression that a man doesn't love a woman unless he beats her.
But that suggests a desperation for just wanting to belong, perhaps stemming from breakdown of family in the first place.
Well, that's right. I think yes, it's just it becomes
Cycle.
a vicious circle.
So many topics I want to cover off, running out of time, so I want to keep moving along. In New Zealand, we've decided that we want to not build more prisons, that we need to find alternatives. Prisons are obviously not working because everybody wants to get into them. I mean, that's a very backhand way of saying it, but it seems like rather than we're not dealing with the primary, which is what you said, is why are people committing crimes in the first place. Is prison supposed to be a deterrent?
Well, it's supposed to be a deterrent, but principally, I think, and before you say that prison doesn't work, you have to decide what you expect of prison. I mean, you don't buy a lawnmower and then go to the shop and complain that it hasn't given you a good haircut, because that's not what it's for. So what you've got to decide what prison is for, and I think in present circumstances, at any rate, prison is mainly to protect society from the depredations of recidivists. And so in that sense, it works. The problem is it hasn't been used properly. If you send recidivists to prison many times for 3 months, they'll end up spending quite a lot of their lives in prison. But they will learn nothing. It won't protect society. It embitters all the victims and, in fact, creates more victims. It allows an atmosphere of intimidation to develop in society. We've seen it recently with the 2 JPs in New Zealand hiding their identity because they're so afraid of the criminals. This is a very, very bad sign.
A number of Christian groups have floated this idea of restorative justice. Is there a place for that?
I'm sceptical about that. I think restitution, financial restitution funded by the work of prisoners might be a good method. I think that is more likely to work. Restorative justice is, well, I don't believe that it will in the end work. And of course, it may put burdens upon victims to meet with their with the criminals who have victimised them, and they may find that very traumatic.
Does it help a criminal, though, to understand the personal impact of their actions?
I think it. I don't think they have any doubts about it anyway. I mean, they just don't care. The problem is they don't really care. And one of the things that is very interesting in prison is that, of course, as I keep saying, the principal victims of crime are the poor, not the well-to-do. So we hear that most criminals come from a certain kind of background. Well, most of their victims come from that background as well. And in prison, for example, you often meet burglars whose houses have been burgled, and they sometimes meet the burglar in the prison, and violence results. And so they're fully aware of what the effects of their crimes on others, but they don't care about the effects of crimes on others because they're so egotistical.
Your thoughts on welfare, because many people see welfare as an important aspect for widows, for people who are suffering from mental illness, some sickness, for those who, perhaps are just victims of a violent partner, for example. There's a place for welfare, but you also make the suggestion that welfare is actually making the problem worse, that it's making crime worse.
Yeah. Well, first of all, in my experience of working in a welfare bureaucracy, which I've done for many years, I found that you can't, for example, say of any particular case that it's deserving. You can't say this person particularly deserves help because we've disconnected desert from what we do for or to people. And that leads to callousness. So the bureaucracies are actually very callous, and when you look at them close up, or if you actually fall into their ambit, you will know that they are very callous, they're not caring at all. And I think that they have done quite a lot to create the very problems that they're meant to solve.
Why would they create the problems?
Because they create dependence, because if assistance is allocated according to need, the worse you behave, the needier you become. And so what one actually finds is that people with Alzheimer's disease and multiple sclerosis and all kinds of conditions where they really are not responsible for their own misfortunes, those people tend to get rather short shrift, I'm afraid.
Okay, so how do we get around that? I mean, if you're a Minister of Social Development in New Zealand, how do we get rid of the dependency but also acknowledge that there is a place for welfare?
Well, I think the first thing we have to be clear is I don't think you can just cut off welfare now because you've got so many welfare dependents, and the fact is that if you just stop welfare payments to them, it would be extremely difficult. So although some people have suggested that I am going around saying that we withdraw the money that we're actually paying now, I'm not saying anything like that. But I haven't got actual detailed proposals for New Zealand or indeed anywhere else. But I think we must look to the future and say there are certain conditions under which you will not get welfare. And I think we ought to have fiscal, for example, fiscal incentives for people to marry or at least to have some kind of contractual arrangement so that they stay together. And if they don't stay together, they lose those benefits. And they're not benefits, they're refraining, actually. It's the government refraining from taxing them in the first place. And things like we need to get rid of no-blame divorce, for example, which is not only is it socially disastrous, but it's grossly unjust, often. So these are the kind of things that I would like to see. And, of course, this will not overnight change the situation. I don't think you can change the situation overnight.
But it does involve a change. Dr. Dalrymple, we do appreciate your time. Welcome to New Zealand. We hope you return again soon.
Thank you.